This lecture tonight honors Frank Kelly. Frank was a founder of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and he served as its senior vice president throughout his life. In honor of Frank, we give this Kelly lecture. Our Kelly lecturer tonight is Daniel Ellsberg. I'd like to tell you just a few things about Dan's life. He has a BA degree and a PhD degree from Harvard University. Dan served in the United States Marine Corps as an operations officer and as the company commander of a rifle company. He was at the RAND Corporation as a strategic analyst, and he was a consultant to the Defense Department and the White House, focusing on problems of command and control of nuclear weapons, nuclear war plans, and crisis decision-making. In 1961, he drafted the guidance from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the operational plans for general nuclear war. He was a member of two of the three working groups that reported to the Executive Committee of the National Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In 1964, he joined the Defense Department as a special assistant to Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He worked on the escalation of the war in Vietnam. The following year, he transferred to the State Department to serve for 2 years in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, evaluating pacification in the field. When Dan returned to the RAND Corporation in 1967, he went to work on the top-secret McNamara study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, 1945 to 1968, which later became known as the Pentagon Papers. He photocopied the 7,000-page study and gave it to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. 2 years later, in 1971, he gave the study to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. He was put on trial, and there were 14 felony counts. The charges against him were ultimately dismissed based upon U.S. government misconduct in the trial. Dan Ellsberg is one of the brightest men I know, and one of the most moral and courageous. He is the recipient of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation's Distinguished Peace Leadership Award, and also the recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, which is given in Sweden and known also as the Alternative Nobel Prize. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Ellsberg. Thank you. Well, I am changing my speech very strikingly because of something that I read during dinner tonight, about half an hour ago, that I got off the internet. And so bear with me as I try to relate to two things that I've just read. One of which was so hard, such a terrible copy here, the internet, that I can't read it, but the restaurant kindly loaned me an extra pair of glasses. I've heard of 4 eyes, this is 6 eyes. I never heard of this before, but it actually works. And now, very well, but I've also misplaced the first page of this, which is in my notes somewhere. But anyway, it's a trip down memory lane here for me, away, because it's an article that was actually written 19 years ago in a university magazine, and describes the work of a group against armament on the campus of this university by the senior who was writing it, and says that their object was to tell people
enough about the issues so that they could make their own judgment, not to try to tell them what the policy should be, but to enlighten them. And only one person is mentioned actually in the course of this. That's what caught my eye here. As an outsider, mostly it's interviews by the senior who wrote it with people at the university describing what they were doing. But it does say that in the interest of educating the people, they tried to bring in outside speakers such as Daniel Ellsberg to campus, publishing, and he makes a point of that. He's talking about the freeze movement, which was going on at that time, 83, and of course I was on the strategy task force of the freeze. The writer of this article actually is a little condescending toward the freeze, which, remember, proposed that the Soviet Union and the US undertake not to build any more weapons. They say the senior who wrote this was saying that the group to which he was sympathetic on the campus had brought outside speakers, and the only one they name actually is Daniel Ellsberg. So they showed good taste there, obviously, in the writer. But it did say that their point was not to proselytize or not to tell people what to think or whatever, but to give them the information. The writer of the article I said a minute ago, was a bit condescending about the freeze, which merely cut off the arms race. This was 83. Actually, the height of the number of weapons in the world, deployed weapons, was actually in 87, which interestingly was, Gorbachev came in 85. The Cold War was on its way to ending, although I don't think people saw that even as late as 87, certainly not in 83. But this was late in the game. The actual height of US and Soviet weapons together, not just strategically deployed, was, I just read, something like 65, the year I went to Vietnam. As a matter of fact, when the number of nuclear weapons in the world together topped 65,000. So at this point, it doesn't say exactly, but the US had, I think, something close to 30,000 weapons. So cutting them off, on the one hand, didn't seem to solve the problem. But on the other hand, it was still rising. And he was saying, the author of this was saying that what we really needed was to reduce weapons. He was very much in favor of a comprehensive test ban, which we didn't have then. And I was also struck, this is no doubt why I was going around speaking, when interviewed by this writer, why it's worth focusing on disarmament or arms control rather than and looking at the symptoms of the problem rather than the problem itself, the student from this organization said, we do focus primarily on catastrophic weapons. Look, here's the worst part. We say, here's the worst part, let's work on that. You're not going to get rid of the military in the near future, so let's at least work on this. And he specifically talked about not only the freeze, but work they were doing on seeing the checking of Pershing II and cruise missiles deployment as crucial. Now, how many people in this select audience remember the Pershing II issue? Gee, I don't see, come on, let's see a hand or two. How many do not? Okay, so you're tracking here. And a lot of you are not sure whether you remember, but the Pershing II was a very fast and super accurate weapon placed in Germany, and thus only minutes, literally 10 minutes total flight time to Germany and to Russia. And the Russians feared that it was exactly suited with its accuracy and warhead and speed to decapitate the Kremlin, the command and control in Russia. We assured them that no, it really, its range was 200 miles short of that. But it turned out, though, that what they meant was we'd only tested it 200 miles. The Russians were really not off the mark when they had an uneasy feeling that it was actually aimed at them, along with the very accurate cruise missiles, of course. And I was going over there, in fact, I did civil disobedience in in Germany against the Pershing and the Crews, because I did indeed feel that at that moment these were the most dangerous weapons in the world. Precisely because the Soviets thought they were the most dangerous weapons, and as I've just said, with really very good reason. This was under Reagan, but Carter, before him, had his aide, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had been talking very publicly about the need to decapitate. That was the Russians, and especially work on getting their command and control centers wherever they were. And I was very, very frightened when I heard all this. Having worked on war plans, as David pointed out earlier, and specifically on command and control, I said that is virtually demanding to the Russian ears that they go to delegation of their weapons so they will not be paralyzed by a single warhead landing on Moscow, whoever it comes from. Now, that was 83. It was many years later, maybe 10 at least, when Bruce Blair, who was a former Minuteman launch control officer, and has been now for years very good, he was head of the Center for Defense Information, which now has another name, very expert on command and control, discovered from his contacts during Gorbachev's glasnost, the openness that briefly reigned in Russia, that the Soviets had indeed responded, you could say in a certain sense rationally, but you'll see the limits of that term in a moment, by saying we can't allow them to paralyze our huge forces with one bomb or several bombs on Moscow. And so they built what they called the dead hand system, very secretly, which was in one form, in its initial proposal, was fully automated. In the end, not entirely. But the idea was that if a bomb exploded on Moscow, various kinds of sensors, electromagnetic and sound and infrared and all these, would send a signal that there had been this explosion to one of several sites where there were missiles ready to go. And as I say in the first form of this, the idea was that these signals would set the missiles off automatically, not toward the US, but over their own missile fields, conveying the launch order. So that a bomb on Moscow, which, by the way, as we know later, could have been, let's say, put by the Chechens, who were in fact trying very hard to get hold of a bomb, to put it on Moscow, as a matter of fact. But a bomb like that, that sort of condition, or someone else who wanted to create, or an unauthorized action on our part. I'll come back to that possibility. But a single bomb then would automatically lead to the launching of the entire Soviet fleet. A doomsday machine, in other words, that was at first fully automatic. Eventually, they rejected that idea of full automaticity and put some low-level humans in the picture who would get the signal and be ordered to respond to it by sending off the missiles, by sending off the rockets with their signal. And in theory, one or more of those people could decline to do it, to follow their orders, but that was their order. But so you had a human in the system at that. We learned of this, as I say, years and years later, after they kept it entirely secret, which is interesting in a way. I say, as a strategic analyst, that was my job. Because as in Dr. Strangelove, if you remember, how many people remember the movies Dr. Strangelove? Well, you remember they had an automatic doomsday machine. That was in 1964 that came out, some 20 years earlier. And the Kissinger figure, or the Dr. Strangelove, says to the ambassador, well, he was an amalgam of my colleague Herman Kahn and Werner von Braun and Kissinger, but his academic background was Kissinger's and his accent. And he was, but the whole point of this is to let the other side know. How could you keep it secret? And the answer is, well, we were going to tell you, later, but we hadn't gotten around to it. In short, the plans for decapitation, which go back all the way to the nuclear era, Moscow was always the number one target, so much so that every unit that had any nuclear weapons would do anything, including one-way suicide missions, and I'm not joking about that, to get their weapon on Moscow. And at one point, when I was looking at this in 1960, somebody calculated that there were 157 weapons scheduled for Moscow all over the world. The idea being that that would give you a chance to paralyze the system and let our bombers get over. In those days, it was mainly bombers, later missiles, get over there and pick out their weapons, have lots of time to go around because they were sitting there paralyzed without orders to go, okay? Rational in its way. The only way that was offered since the late 50s to have any hope of getting off possibly scot-free over here. That was the one thing that might do it. Of course, the problem was, supposing they delegated. Well, the answer was, they're much more careful and concerned about nuclear weapons than we are. Eisenhower had delegated under exactly such circumstances. That was a super secret at the time. I was one of the first civilians to learn that. I briefed McGeorge Bundy on it, and when he came into office in his first month, and was given by him a task to look further into it and make recommendations and so forth. That's another story. But we had delegated. Kennedy repeated it. Every president since has done so. The National Security Archive has finally, at George Washington University in DC, you can look up NS Archive, has documents that have finally been declassified a few years ago, after 40 years, showing the early Eisenhower and the Kennedy part, but not going into the later ones. Those haven't been declassified. It remains secret. Now, as I've just suggested, there's a funny aspect about keeping that secret, because you're virtually inviting the other side to hope for paralyzing your system by hitting your capital. In fact, you've made arrangements that are subject to false alarm and subject to some problems. They're a little risky. In fact, they sound so dangerous that you can't afford to tell your people that you've done this. But unless you tell the Soviets, you're virtually asking them in a crisis to hope for paralyzing your system by hitting Washington, which will not paralyze the system, but lead to a full-scale attack. So what the Russians did was exactly what we did. Same. So you have two systems. By the way, it's maintained the same now. They've maintained their dead hand system. They've kept it up to date up till now, according to Blair and others, as have we. To some degree, you have to. You know, what's the alternative? You cannot allow, if you're relying on deterrence and you're relying on nuclear weapons, you can't allow the single person, as we're always told, you and the public, I must say, that only the president can do this. If that were the case, a single Hinckley type who shot Reagan, and by the way, the story is, gee, when he shot Reagan and there was all the confusion, Reagan was separated from the football. A lot has been made of that. The aide who carries a briefcase called the football with the enabling codes, right? How many people have heard of that story? Okay, you've even seen pictures of it. When a president is inaugurated, this has been shown on television sometimes, TV. They go through a very elaborate, dramatic moment when the officer who carries the football, at the moment that the swearing in is completed, shifts his gaze and his allegiance to the new president, who now has the power. All of these stories meant to symbolize what we're often told, that the president, the leader of the free world, has this awesome responsibility that he alone can launch these forces. That has never been true. It is not true now. It really couldn't be true in a way, for reasons I've given. The 9/11 people aiming at the White House, if they caught that, that means that the Strategic Air Command would be totally paralyzed if you think about it, they're not really going to allow that to happen. There remains a question which is not easy to answer, even probably for the president. Just how many fingers are on the button? How far down does that delegation go? When I say I have no reason to think that the president knows that reliably, because I informed McGeorge Bundy when he was the assistant to recently Senator John F. Kennedy, first month in his inauguration, he did not know that month of this delegation. He found it out. And my point I was mainly making to him was that that delegation, which I'd learned about in the Pacific doing studies of command and control, was in fact redelegated down to commanders of the fleets, the 7th Fleet, I think it was the 9th Fleet at that point also, and PACAF, Pacific Air Force, and so forth. Various commanders had that, and they had in turn delegated it down below. Just how far did it go down? I'll come back to that in a moment, but there was reason to believe it went all the way down effectively. Now, I've been saying, as a strategic analyst, consultant to the Defense Department then, I had mixed feelings about this delegation at all, but you had to accept the idea that some delegation, let's say to the commander of SAC, but he was on the ground mostly, so basically to a brigadier general who's flying around SAC, somebody else had to be able to send those forces off. And yet I thought the system needed a lot more control than it had, lest it go down all the way and you get 1,000 fingers on the button, which is not a bad estimate, by the way. And the same in Russia. I started to say earlier, our opinion of the Soviets was their authoritarian system, they don't want any of their people to have their fingers on the button. They control it very carefully. And we knew, for instance, that they kept warheads separate from tactical missiles generally. Their missiles in East Europe and elsewhere tended to be controlled, in fact everywhere, by special units of the KGB, the secret intelligence unit, not their ordinary military. So we thought, well, that's, they're serious about it. They're doing it right in a way, from my perspective. They wouldn't do this. But they did. It was wrong. In fact, I'll leap ahead here for a moment. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think David mentioned that I was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will remember that a major uncertainty, as I was sleeping in the Pentagon for a number of days toward the climax of the crisis, that a major uncertainty was, do they have warheads for their missiles in Cuba? We knew they had the missiles. We thought we knew all of them. That was wrong. They took out more than we had seen when they finally got out. But do they have warheads for them? The blockade had stopped a number of ships. One of the ships that had stopped was believed to be, for various reasons, the one that had the warheads on it. And so did they have them or not? Well, it was sometimes said, well, we have to assume that they had them. But strictly speaking, they didn't assume that. Really, and the general and CIA itself thought it was unlikely that the warheads had arrived for a number of reasons. That was 62. It was, I believe, 92, 30 years later in that area, that we learned from the Russians in Glasnost, who were now telling it from their point of view, the following. Not only had the warheads arrived before the missiles, some of them before the missiles had been discovered, but the rest of them, warheads, had taken advantage of the 2-day hiatus between President Kennedy's speech and the actual blockade, switched course, got into the nearest port, and just before the blockade went into effect on Wednesday morning, on Tuesday night, the warheads were delivered. So they did have the warheads there. But two other things came out. We knew they had medium-range missiles. We knew they had sights for intermediate-range missiles, actually longer range. Actually, the longer-range ones were stopped. They didn't get there. They had the warheads, but not the missiles. But the medium-range, they had. They also had tactical missiles. so-called we called them FROG, free rocket over ground. They had a different designation, which we knew were there, but it did not occur to anybody that they had nuclear warheads. They were dual capable, but they'd been often sent to other satellites or clients. They'd sent frogs to Egypt, for example, without nuclear warheads. They were capable of sending conventional. And they were relatively short range. Some were 20 miles, some as long as 60 miles, but none 90 miles to Florida. It's like the Pershing. In this case, they really couldn't reach Florida. And the warheads what we didn't know was that the warheads were there for them, 100 tactical warheads, Hiroshima-sized or larger. And at the beginning of the crisis, just before Kennedy's speech, Khrushchev had delegated the use of those missiles to the local commanders if they were under attack. Now, how could he do that? Well, actually, he took it back. The story gets complicated, and I won't go into the whole thing. He took it back after the speech when he got worried and really quite quickly decided that eventually he was going to take them out of there. But as they realized, as the Russians have said in their memoirs and so forth, under attack, no one could tell that people would obey those orders to wait for communications with Moscow when communications would be out for a variety of reasons. They wouldn't get an execute order. They wouldn't be communicating with Moscow. We would have stopped that. And two, they're under attack. Why had he delegated it all? Because initially, with the whole Politburo had agreed on that. These are, Stalin, these are not wild, reckless guys in the Politburo. They're bureaucrats, apparatchiks. And they all agreed that since the rockets couldn't reach Florida, why not use them against an invading force, which they expected? Somehow believing that if we had lost 100,000 men, as McNamara later estimated when he heard this, to nuclear weapons, that would not have resulted in a limited nuclear war. We would have responded, said McNamara, and he was the Secretary of Defense, with an all-out attack on Russia. And I'll give a reason, too, why that may have seemed rational at that or acceptable. But anyway, that's the way it was. So here we were, 48 hours away for invasion on Saturday in October. A U-2 had, one of our reconnaissance planes, had just been shot down by a commander in Soviet. Khrushchev himself, we assumed it had to be by Khrushchev's orders. So that was a strong escalation of the crisis. Actually, it wasn't. How could people do things that weren't under the control of this authoritarian dictator? Well, it wasn't. Khrushchev himself didn't know who'd done it. For over a day, he was admonishing Castro for having somehow gotten control of that missile and shot it down, which Castro would have done if he had been able to get control of it. He was calling for shooting at these things. But Castro hadn't ordered it. It was a local Soviet commander going against his orders to check with his immediate superior before ever firing that. Couldn't get the superior on the phone, so the Cubans were all firing their anti-aircraft, and in solidarity with the Cubans, he shot the U-2 down. Now, Kennedy had earlier promised the JCS, it was part of the plan, that if one U-2 was shot down, we would immediately take out all the surface-to-air missiles, all the surface-to-air missiles, the SAMs, against the plane, and possibly go ahead against all the missiles then. Kennedy chose not to do that. He reversed himself on that. He said, we'll wait another day, but if they shoot another one down, and he wasn't just kidding on that, and he communicated that to Khrushchev that night through Bobby Kennedy. Shoot one more down, and we go all the way. Okay. Khrushchev knew some things that Bobby Kennedy, who I talked to about this, did not know at that time. I'm giving you something here which is not in the history books particularly, although the individual elements of it pretty much are, but they haven't connected the dots. I spent nearly a year studying the Cuban Missile Crisis for the government, in '64, having been part of it, with access much higher than top secret. And I was able to interview people, including Bobby Kennedy. And I'm writing a book, finally, it's coming out on this. But this fits into what I've been talking about in the following way. Bobby that night tells Dobrynin, the ambassador, you have 48 hours to get those missiles out. That would be Monday. This is Saturday night. But if you shoot another plane down, and we assumed they were in total control of the anti-aircraft. We knew that Cubans manned the anti-aircraft, but we assumed that that satellite, that puppet, Castro, was totally under the control of Khrushchev. We said, don't let him do that again, or we go right away. Now, that was the kind of assumption we made about Ho Chi Minh, later totally under the control of Moscow or Beijing, we didn't know which, but something like that. Wrong. Castro, for 2 days, had been saying to Khrushchev, who told him not to fire, not to provoke the situation, because he intended to get the missiles out eventually. So not to do that. And Castro was saying, just to paraphrase, fuck you. This is my country. It's our airspace. We're about to be invaded. Do not tell us that we can't fire at people who are invading our airspace. So Khrushchev was very nervous about the fact the firing was happening on Saturday, and now he has a Soviet SAM. They were under control of Soviets, are also firing. What was that about? That could happen again momentarily. And I want to put this right into the picture too. The behavior of the Cubans and of the surface-to-air missile Soviet commander rammed home the point, you can't control these people. They don't have locks on the weapons. If they're under fire, there's a high chance, not a certainty, a high chance that they will fire what they have. And here's what Khrushchev knew when he heard from Bobby Kennedy. One more plane goes down, this is in the evening, and it all goes. He knew he had warheads on his MRBMs that might be fired by the Soviets or could be taken over by the Cubans, although that was not likely. He'd put 40,000 troops there to guide those MRBMs so that Cubans couldn't do that. We had estimated first that he had 10,000, and then at the end of the crisis, we got the estimate up to 14,000. Had we invaded on Monday or Tuesday, our troops would have run into 40,000 Soviet troops, which we didn't know were there. Plus about 240,000 Cubans. They were passing out AK-47s on the street practically. The whole country was armed. But more seriously than that, Khrushchev knew, A, he did not control Castro's gunners. They would fire, and as Castro put it later, on Friday, or on Saturday rather, they'd never fired at a live target before. They were getting better every hour. Every hour. And he said, I have no doubt that by Sunday morning we would have hit a plane. They had, in fact, hit. Now, 2 planes got bullet holes in them, but were not downed on Saturday. Second, well, he knew he couldn't control the Cubans. Second, he knew that there were warheads for tactical nuclear weapons, which he had ordered the local commanders not to use, even if they're being killed. But he knew that he couldn't control that. And he at least knew that use those nuclear weapons against Americans. He had now sort of gotten the picture from what had been happening that week. The Soviet Union was going to be annihilated. Annihilated. That could happen at first light Sunday when the reconnaissance planes came over. This was daytime in Moscow, 12 hours different. So they sent at that point, he sent a car to Moscow with a message to deliver on open air, not by the coded methods they'd been using up till then, which took hours to decode at each level, hours to encode, but especially to decode. At the embassy, no time for that. In open air on Radio Moscow, he had a message, we're taking the missiles out. He started the dismantling in the middle of the night, or in early morning, hoping that we would believe him and would see it in time, and that Castro wouldn't shoot down something at that point. In fact, I talked to the person who was in that car, who was carrying the message, Fyodor Berlutsky, a speechwriter who had helped draft the statement. And he said the manager of Radio Moscow was standing on the steps when their car arrived and ran down the steps, grabbed this. No time even to translate. They had to get people, usually they did various things. They translated it as they were speaking virtually. People were giving them bits, and they got it out. They had to do it fast. As another person, actually, Sergei Mikoyan, that I met, I've talked in this connection to Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Khrushchev, Sergei Mikoyan, the son of Mikoyan, who was closest envoy to Castro. And they said they were sitting back at the Dasha saying, if they have a flat tire, if they run off the road, the world goes up, which was true. Attitudes as to how dangerous that crisis was have fluctuated over the years. At various points, people thought, well, it really wasn't that dangerous. And then when they began to learn this, they realized it really was dangerous. McNamara said far more dangerous than he imagined. I think McNamara, if he was still alive, if I'd given him this, connecting these dots, it was more dangerous than virtually anybody realized, anybody on either side who knew the various angles on it. The world almost did go up. Now, what would have happened if Khrushchev hadn't moved that fast? How could McNamara have thought of hitting Russia, first strike, even if we had lost 100,000 men? Now, humanly, of course, anything goes, something like that. You can imagine a human just wanting to revenge, the world goes up. Castro was in that mood. Another thing that scared Khrushchev was that Castro, the night before, had sent Khrushchev a message urging him to strike first. Castro thought, this is a crazy man that I'm dealing with. See? And Castro has explained that later, what he was up to. And he knew about the tactical warheads. He assumed they would be used. He didn't know that an order, for what it's worth, had been given not to use them. So he knew about the tactical missiles. He was sure, and he told Khrushchev this from his all kinds of intelligence, that he was about to be invaded within hours, at the most a day. When invaded, the missiles would be used against American troops. Then the Americans would hit Russia and Cuba. And he said to Khrushchev, don't do what Stalin did in 1941. Don't wait for the other side. Stalin couldn't believe he was going to be hit. So he almost went into a stupor when the invasion did occur. But don't allow that. You must strike first. And he gave him this historical analysis. You must strike first, for what it's worth. Now notice, don't let him destroy you, because of this invasion. Now, if you followed that, you'll see, again, there is a certain coherence to that, right? Logic. There were a couple of things he didn't know. He did say in the 90s, in a mission, I think it was 1995, with a mission, with a conference on Cuba, I had no idea I thought they had 200 missiles, at least, that they could disarm the United States to a considerable extent. And he did say, when McNamara asked him, what did you think would happen to Cuba? Oh, we would be annihilated. But the socialist forces would prevail in the end, in the world, and we were not going to bend our knee to the invaders. We were not going to accept an invasion, which was coming any hour. We'll be annihilated, but in the course of this, McNamara was incredulous that he would think that way, but actually, unfortunately, that happens in history. Where, as I say, Castro was wrong about the situation, where he misread Khrushchev's willingness to strike first, had to do with the following point. And by the way, the author of this paper that I started to tell you about Daniel Ellsberg coming to campus and working on Pershing and this and that, was a young man, 22 years old, with a funny name, Barack Obama. And the right wing has been using this against him. They haven't picked my name out of it yet. They say it's very hard to read. I don't. I don't think any of the Republicans have really read this tiny print far enough and said, Daniel Ellsberg. Yeah. Ha! Now we've got him. So here's who he's listening to, 19 years ago. No wonder he's trying to unilaterally disarm and surrender to the Russians and so forth. In '62, I was actually not worrying at that moment about a Soviet first strike, whatever Castro might have said. It wouldn't have occurred to me that he would recommend it. Because I knew what the Soviets had at that point, and I knew what we had. I hadn't known it very long. Nobody had for just about a year. In late September, in August of 1961, in doing my command and control work and having just written the new guidance for the war plans, which went down to SAC headquarters in the spring and summer of 1961, I went to SAC headquarters to talk to their chief of war plans, whom I'd known from when he was in the Pentagon, Colonel Dave Liebman, and to just see how my guidance was going over down there. What was their reaction to it? And he told me in the course of that, you know what the old man, General Power, who had led the raid against Tokyo under General LeMay in the Second World War, you know what he thinks the Soviets have at this time? 1,000. They have 1,000 missiles. Now we had 40 Atlas and Titan ICBMs, plus in range of Russia, I think it was, figures are not wonderful in my mind at the moment, but about 120 intermediate range missiles, the kind that turned up, that were going to be sent to Cuba the next year. We had them in Turkey, on the border of Russia. Not 90 miles away, actually, from Russia, right on the border of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had noticed that and was making the point, he thought, fecklessly, if you can do it on our border, why can't I do it, to an allied country in the Caribbean? And the answer was, you're number two, we're number one, we're the US of A, and we can do it, you can't do it. That was the answer, which he was trying to refute, but he had to back down for the reasons I've given. Because the situation had gotten out of Khrushchev's control, and before he could back down with more bargaining, which is just that 48-hour thing, that was lots of time for bargaining. The way that process had been going, hour by hour bargaining was going on. 48 hours got lots of time to get something very specific, to get our missiles out of Turkey, openly. But no time to worry about that at the last minute. He had to get them out fast. So we had about 120 IRBMs. And we had 2,000 SAC bombers with refueling, in range of the Soviet Union with refueling, B-48s and B-52s, and about 1,000 tactical weapons on air carriers and in Guam and Okinawa and other places in Europe, heavily in Europe, with nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons. So we had, 3,000 bombers, 172, so 160 IRBMs. Polaris, I didn't put into the picture, about 120 Polaris submarine launch missiles. But, against 1,000. That was in August. But they didn't have 1,000. In late September, the reconnaissance satellites we were sending over very secretly finally covered their missile range, which Gary Powers had been shot down trying to cover with the U-2. Hadn't photographed it up till this time. And what they discovered was that the Soviets had 4 missiles, 4 ICBMs. Power was wrong by 250 times, not 250%, 1,004. By 1962, a U-2 could have destroyed them practically with a grenade. They were liquid fuel. They took hours to fuel. They had very thin skins. A sniper, literally, hard to get a sniper into Russia at Plesetsk, but in principle, a sniper could have picked them off from the road. So by a year later, they were beginning to build some missiles, hardened missiles like our Minutemen. That was in '62. They were building about 40, but they had about 10 operational. So I figured at the time, as I say, when I was in the Pentagon, it was a very exciting crisis, but it is not going to lead to nuclear war because the Soviets have to back down. They have to back down. They, look at them. We have the overwhelming force in the Caribbean, and when it comes to Berlin or Turkey, which the president was worried about, how can they do anything? And indeed, Khrushchev didn't want to do anything. But his military were pressing him not to give in. They were saying, you can't give in. The Albanians will despise us. And Khrushchev says in his memoirs, Albanians? He was not Castro at this moment. He's saying, we should blow the world up so that we will not be held in contempt by the Albanians. It didn't give him a good impression of his military. And of course, Kennedy was saying much the same. When Khrushchev announced that he was taking the missiles off, General LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who he had made Chief of Staff of the Air Force a year earlier, Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the raid against Tokyo and then later Hiroshima, said to him, this is the greatest defeat in our history. He had earlier said, when he chose a blockade, Kennedy, when he chose a blockade rather than immediately striking, neither of them knowing, by the way, that the warheads were already in Cuba before they spoke, and that there were more missiles there than we had spotted. So we couldn't have hit them all in a first strike. But when LeMay heard that he chose a blockade, he said to the president, this is worse than Munich. This is appeasement. At that time, the harshest word you could use in our language, Neville Chamberlain. This is a total, and then he said on the day that Khrushchev took the missiles out, he said, we should go ahead anyway. Hit him now. Go ahead anyway. Strike it. And after the first one of these, Kennedy said to his brother Bobby, he said, can you believe that he said that to me? He said, a nice thing for these generals when they give advice like that is if they're wrong, there will be nobody around to criticize them for having done it. So that's where we were. Okay, so I thought, I'm not worried about nuclear war. This thing has got to go down. It's got to be resolved. I was wrong, terribly wrong. In fact, as I've said, I've often said, a hand's breadth from nuclear war, and what I'm referring to is that there were holes in one of our fighters, I think it was an F-101, a hand's breadth away from the fuel line. And if it had gone down, that was on Saturday, if it had gone down, the thing would have gone up. So that's how close we were to nuclear war. Kennedy did not want to go. He did not want to invade. He was prepared to actually concede, but not yet before that. Let's do better. And he did not want to use nuclear weapons for sure. But, in fact, had that plane gone down, I do not think he could have resisted the military pressure to do what he'd promised to do. Go ahead. Which they were poised to do at a moment's notice, as they kept telling him. It will not take hours, it will be minutes from your order that we will hit Cuba, we'll do this and that will launch. Now, I knew that was possible. I'd seen those planes. He was talking now about conventional. We weren't going to hit them with nuclear weapons in the first instance, not dreaming that we were going to get nuclear weapons back. See, as I say, that would have been insane for Khrushchev. He wasn't insane, but he wasn't in control. And he didn't have locks on the weapons, and he had put the warheads there, which was insane as our filling Europe with nuclear weapons, where there were still 200 U.S. weapons in Belgium and various other places, 20 years after the Cold War, no Warsaw Pact. We still have them there. Okay, we had thousands then. Crazy. Khrushchev had done exactly what we had done in NATO. Facing overwhelming conventional forces in Europe, or what we thought were overwhelming, we put nuclear weapons there without locks on initially. Eventually they got some locks on the lowest level weapons. It took a generation before we got any locks on SAC weapons, Strategic Air Command, and longer than that, much longer, before we got them on Polaris. But at this time, there were no locks on those weapons, on our weapons. And we had delegated to the commander, and he'd undoubtedly delegated down below that. So he'd done what we did. In Cuba, he wants to defend somebody far from his shores, just as Berlin is far from our shores. Can't do it wholly with conventional forces, although he went a lot further than we imagined. He put enough forces in there that had he told us that he had 40,000 troops there, aside from the nuclear, it would have been very hard for us to talk. I don't know if we had enough troops at that point to think of an invasion against that, which we certainly weren't planning at that point. So he was going, that's another way he could have deterred us. But the way he did was the way we did. Put nuclear weapons over there and say you get nuclear war if you go into our far-flung ally where you have overwhelming conventional force. I hope you can see what I'm saying here, and I'm not trying to be rhetorical or funny. I'm seeing there's an ambivalence here, or an ambiguity, between a kind of rationality and imitation of other people and imitation of insanity, recklessness. Cuba has come out, had made the old Bolsheviks feel young again. They adored Che Guevara, who came to Russia and negotiated this thing. And they adored, and that's literally what they said. It made us feel young again. The blood is flowing. A revolutionary, conscientious, committed, a guy who's willing to blow the world up for, that worried them when they learned that, for this. But before that, willing to sacrifice themselves and so forth, disciplined, they realized this is the first country that had voluntarily associated itself with the Soviet Union under threat from the US. So they loved it, and they couldn't let it go, as we were about to invade them anyway. So they had to do it, and Khrushchev thinks hard. How is he going to do it? I won't go through the whole story. You get the picture, I hope. How is he going to do it? And he came up with this thing, I'll do it the way they do it. I'll put nuclear weapons over there, then they can't come. Now, there's a little problem. He didn't tell us he put the nuclear weapons there. That would sound to the world insane, right? Too reckless. So he didn't tell us, meaning that he got no deterrence out of that. I would say, knowing the Kennedy administration, that would have 100% deterred Kennedy. I mean, there's no question of invading if we'd known the actual situation, which he didn't tell us. Likewise, we never told the Soviets we delegated. It's a super secret. Why? Because some of you in this audience might have looked askance at that, felt uneasy about it. So we didn't tell the Soviets, don't think about decapitating us, which they do in their plans, because that isn't going to help you. It's just going to give you a chaotic, ragged, huge response, that's all. They didn't tell us, we didn't tell them, and so forth. That's the way the world is run in the nuclear age. Well, it's always been run that way. Look at World War I, look at a lot of things. But with nuclear weapons, it's consequential in a way that it didn't used to be. One last point on the looseness of our control. Having learned that the president, super secret, Eisenhower, had delegated to CINCPAC, to four-star admiral, and that he had delegated to 7th Fleet and others down below him. I wanted to see how far down this went. I was working for CINCPAC at the time. I was, from 1960, I was 29, yeah. 60 years. And, but I was on a team that was doing command and control work for Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Admiral Feld. So I could go anywhere, do anything, was the idea for Feld. very high. Young guy, but we could go and ask questions, and I won't go through that whole trip. But at one point, I said, okay, I want to see the closest base we have to the Soviet Union. And that was a little base called Kunsan in Korea, and north in South Korea. And it was just minutes from the Soviet border. It was probably the closest base in the world. There might have been something else that I didn't know, but as far as I knew, that was the closest. So I got to Kunsan and met the major in charge of a little field there that looked like a little cow town, a cowboy movie or something, very dusty and small little place. No saloon, but that's about it. A couple of Quonset huts for people and so forth. And 12 F-100s, each of which had an underslung 1.1 megaton weapon. Now, oh boy, I am over time here. Well, see, even in this select audience, my guess is from previous audiences that there are a lot of people here who actually don't have a clear picture of the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb. That may sound like a joke to some of you, but how many honestly could say, let me see hands, do not really know confidently the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb? Let me see. Take a look around. It's a fair number. Could be more. Used to be more. This is a good audience. How many do know? Okay, most of you do know. So for those who don't, I'll just sum it up. The A-bomb, the atomic fission bomb, the kind that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the trigger for an H-bomb, for a thermonuclear weapon. Every thermonuclear weapon, of which we have many thousands, at one point we had like 20,000, every one has a Nagasaki-type bomb as its detonator. And the early ones were 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It's easier to make a large one first. To get a small one, which we now have of all kinds of sizes, it takes many, many tests, even for us, and super laboratories, and it's hard. It's very hard to make an H-bomb at all, including a large H-bomb, but you start with large H-bombs. India fizzled in a way that none of our tests ever did fizzle. They apparently tried to test an H-bomb with their tests and failed, maybe more than once. North Korea does not have H-bombs. Pakistan does not have and India do not have H-bombs. With more testing, which the Republicans want to start, and not only Republicans, they will get H-bombs. The difference is, as I say, between taking a piece out of a moderate-sized city like Hiroshima and destroying utterly the largest metropolitan area with one large H-bomb. All of Los Angeles, all of metropolitan New York with a 10 or 20 megaton bomb. Megaton means millions of tons of TNT equivalent. A-bombs are measured in kilotons, 1,000 tons of TNT. Hiroshima was 13,000 tons. There's a factor of 1,000 between those. So it's a difference. It's a big difference. Okay, well, what my major then had that I was meeting was under him was 12 1.1 megaton weapons. That's a little over 13 megatons, 13 million tons of TNT equivalent. The explosives of the explosive power of all the bombs we dropped in World War II, in Germany, all over Europe, Pacific, including the A-bombs, was 2 million tons. So he had 6 World War IIs under his command, this major. So I wanted to see what his understanding was of, and it was clear that he did know the big secret that a year later in his first month, Kennedy did not know, that there had been delegation to Admiral Felt. So I said, under what conditions would you, actually what I first asked him was, how close are you before you get into enemy radar, into Soviet radar, before they see you coming? He said, well, that's very classified. I can't tell you that. And I said, well, okay, you need my credentials. Let's find out. So I had him call Tokyo. But all communications were out with Tokyo, as was true part of every day for atmospheric disturbances. And that's why the president had given the delegation to CINCPAC, if communications are out, you're on your own for that period. That meant part of every day. Admiral Felt at least had that power. Well, now we just had a little demonstration. So it took about an hour and a half before communications came in. I read magazines and things. And finally the word came in, yes, you can tell Dr. Ellsberg whatever he asks. So he said, now what was that question again? And so I gave him, how long will it take to get inside of here? So he says, I don't know. So I took that as sincere. He seemed by this time to be fairly forthcoming. So then I said, okay, what would happen now if communications were out during a crisis and you had reason to believe that we might be in war, in a Taiwan crisis just a couple years earlier? And he said, well, you know what my orders are, right? I said, yes, I think so. I said, you tell me though. He said, well, I would take my planes, by the way, his orders, because he was so close to the Soviet Union, most bases were permitted under warning to take their planes off and go circle in a rendezvous area. This was called the fail-safe procedure, and get them off the ground so they couldn't be destroyed. And then if there was no explicit order to go forward, they're to come back. And that's why it's fail-safe. If it's a false alarm, you'll get out of danger, but you won't go to target. You only go to target if you get an explicit order. So I said, okay, but what if you thought that there was an attack, but you were out of communications? He said, well, you know what I'm supposed to do, and we went through this. I said, but what would you do? He said, I'd tell him to take off. Because I said, I'm the commander of this base, and the oldest rule of war is that a commander has the right and the responsibility to protect his troops. So he would violate that standing order, but he wasn't apologetic about that. I said, okay, what then? What would happen? He said, well, you know what they do. They're supposed to go to a rendezvous area, and they circle around, and if they don't get an order to go ahead, and in theory, there was supposed to be a communications plane that would relay that order to them. But what if the plane was out of range or didn't take off? A problem here was that if there really was an attack, they almost surely would not get that communication because the attack would shut off communications with electromagnetic pulse and various things. So what if you thought there wasn't one and they're up there and they don't get an order to come back? What do you think they do? What would they do? He says, I think they'd come back. Most of them. And I was thinking, before he said most of them, I was thinking, you think they'd come back? You're in charge of their training, of their discipline, of their everything here, and you think they'd come back? But he went on to say, before I could even react to that, I was trying to keep a straight face, he said, most of them. And he said, of course, if one goes to target, they might as well all go. As in Dr. Strangelove, if you recall that. Which is, again, logical, no? So one plane's going to do it. Okay, there's the logic, Hinckley logic for this. I came back and I reported this kind of thing. Let me talk longer than I'm supposed to now. Let me try to, as I said, I took off from this thing. The mention of Pershing made me think of it. Pershing was a very dangerous weapon. The year before, I was spending all my time away from home, and I had a 2-year-old baby at that time, and it was hard on my marriage. But I felt that the Pershing in Germany was the one that was an extremely dangerous weapon. 2 years before, I had campaigned in Europe and elsewhere against the neutron bomb, which I then thought was the most dangerous weapon, for reasons I won't go into here, the one that was going to likely start a war, because it looked so usable, so small, so reasonable, like these bunker busters, that we're looking at now for Iran. That'll be a precedent. So I tried to stop that, and actually the movement did stop the neutron bomb, and Carter was so embarrassed to have to back off on that he okayed the Pershings after all, and the cruise missile. So now we had that. And so I was working on that. It was dangerous, as I say, because it kept both sides in a situation where they were likely to respond to a false alarm of the kind that happened frequently. They haven't gone all the way, and I have to spend more time on that, which I won't take David here, but false alarms are very frequent. Usually they're resolved within a few minutes. In 1979, 4 years before this article, 3 alarms went into 8 minutes or 10 minutes of the 12 to 15 that the president has at the most to respond. 2 of those were caused apparently or probably by a 76-cent computer chip. The other one, much more serious. They got signals. In the first case, they thought this can't be an attack because we're not getting confirmation from our satellites, from our radar. We're just getting this communication that there's an attack going on. It must be something wrong. The other one gave very precise orbits, ballistic trajectories of missiles coming in from the sea, from submarines, over the pole, bombers coming at us, everything coordinated, exactly like a good Soviet attack. By the way, in both these instances, the people who were supposed to respond to this in 3 minutes went 8 minutes or so and were fired as a result. But what was the case where everything's coming? Perfect. Somebody had put a training tape, a simulation of an attack, into the system, and it went through, and they couldn't tell any difference from an actual attack. They weren't supposed to be able to tell any difference, but the guy wasn't supposed to put the training tape in to that particular circuit. That was in '79. Well, I could give lots of examples like that. Under such circumstances, a weapon like the Pershing, which is vulnerable, and to be used at all, has to be used fast, and to have its effect has to be used fast. Get in the commander control there before they can do anything. And which the other side can hit if they act fast. That puts both sides on a hair trigger, a weapon like that. So actually the freeze movement, did have an effect. Reagan reacted in various ways. It was a little indirect, but not too indirect. The freeze movement had a great deal to do with the fact that there are no IRBMs in Europe, in Russia, or the other. It was an enormous, it wasn't as much as they hoped for, but it was an enormous improvement and making things much safer. I plan to get arrested tomorrow at Vandenberg Air Force Base to protest the launching, to protest a test launching of a Minuteman III, which is held regularly 3 times a year at Vandenberg. Now, 19 years ago, I got arrested half a mile from Ground Zero trying to stop the first test of the MX. We may have actually delayed it for a few hours because they weren't sure they had all of us, and we were spread-eagled on the ground, and there were dogs snuffling at us and so forth. That was 19 years ago, but that was a very special test. This is not special. We have hundreds of, I've seen different figures, oddly, because they do change. 500 Minutemen. I think 350 is probably the best figure. Others say 450. Should be able to pin that down, but I don't have it at the moment. But we have hundreds of Minuteman missiles. The Minuteman missile is smaller than the MX. And it now has only 1 warhead. It used to have 3. The MX was going to have 10. Otherwise, it has exactly the same first strike characteristics as the MX, which a lot of you will remember got a lot of opposition and finally managed to stop it and get a mutual treaty that abandoned it. Why? Because it's vulnerable in Minuteman silos. It cannot survive an enemy first strike, so it's only a first strike weapon. And it is a first strike weapon because with its precision and its warhead, it can go against the Soviet, or Russian now, vulnerable missiles. A vulnerable, quick-reacting missile like this, and the Minuteman can react within seconds to minutes basically, is a lightning rod for attack. It tells the president he's about, if there's a warning, he's about to lose those weapons unless he uses them quickly. But if he uses them quickly enough, they may hit a lot of Soviet missiles before they're launched. And so he's got to make that decision fast, and he's really got to go fast. Same thing in Russia, exactly the same. A problem there, you see the logic. A problem is that since about 65, which is 47 years ago, whichever side goes first in such a situation will not have a tangible effect on limiting their own damage, because with submarine missiles on both sides that cannot be targeted like that, you're going to be annihilated, and most of the world with you. So the idea of preemption has been, in logical terms, a hoax, a fraud, an absurdity, and a danger for at least 45 years. In 1961, or two, go back to the missile crisis, in 1962, McNamara could destroy the 10 more or less soft Soviet missiles by attacking first with high confidence and the very likely, not certainty, but the likelihood we would not get a single warhead on our territory. There was a catch. They had hardly any submarines at that time, some cruise missiles and so forth. 2 years later, they had many hardened missiles, submarine missiles, and any such thought was hopeless. It made no sense at all to preempt or to have the missiles that forced you to preempt or to do it. So technicalities and so forth, but I hope you can follow that. 2 years later, that was in 64, 65, there was always a catch, even in 61 and 62. We could prevent them from hitting the US, but they had hundreds of MRBMs aimed at Europe. Mobile ones, in many cases, which we couldn't find. We could not attack all of them. And they had thousands of tactical short-range airplanes. Had we gone, as McNamara said, because of 100,000 dead, we would have gotten off probably scot-free. Maybe they would have gotten 1 or 2 rounds, enough to destroy 1 or 2 major cities. Terrible, but they're annihilated. And Europe would have been annihilated. Annihilated. As far as I know, that was never taken into account. And when I say I was inside the system, not to this day is it really taken into account in calculations. There was never any chance of saving people in Russia, in Europe, and beyond Europe. 20 years, I'm sorry to go on, but this is crucial still. 20 years ago, 29 years ago, 1983, Carl Sagan and Turco and others came up with findings that were at the time propagandized against and demonized. They were right, and it's been well confirmed now, and is now confirmed in the last few years, even more and more. The smoke from the burning cities that we were going to hit, even if we nominally targeted military targets as we do within the city or on the edge of the city, the smoke, in the case of a large attack, 150 million tons of black smoke. But in the case of our alert forces, now, the forces we'll have after the latest reductions, would cause 50 million tons of smoke and would go into the stratosphere, create a blanketing cloud that would shut off, in that case, in the case of a large attack, 70% of sunlight, and what's now realized, not for a year, but for 10 years, meaning all crops fail, everybody starves. It's now calling it nuclear famine rather than nuclear winter, and that's global nuclear famine. But what does it take to do that? It turns out now lately, and again I could give you references on this, a war between India and Pakistan, whose forces we can believe are about as well guarded and well kept as we were in the 50s or the 60s. As loose, let me say, I don't want to be, irony is not suitable here, are as prone to preemption as we've ever been. A war involving only 50 Hiroshima-type weapons, which is what they have, and they have 50 each, 50 each, would destroy the ozone layer of most of the world and cause clouds from the smoke that do not have the effect of a huge attempt by us. They don't cut out 70% of the sunlight. They only cut out 7 to 10% over 10 years. So that the figures are that about 1 billion people, not everybody, would starve in that case, ending the growing season. If India and Pakistan, which they've come close to nuclear war several times in the last 20 years, in other words, everybody's implicated. Bottom line, 300 weapons, you may have heard that figure now, is an absurdly low figure that the DOD is recklessly considering right now. These are the words of the Republicans. Reckless lunacy, says a Republican, to think of 300. 300 kills everybody. I checked this with a very good environmental scientist yesterday that David put me onto, Stephen Starr, S-T-A-R-R, and I very much urge you to read his website, nucleardarkness.org. Very detailed, very voluminous. And he confirmed to me today, I said, you don't give a figure for 300. What would 300 do? End life on Earth, essentially. Not the bacteria, not the viruses, but complex life, not just humans. It'll do what happened to the dinosaurs. Basically, when an asteroid hit the Earth and blocked off the sunlight. 300 is outrageously too high for any country to have. Nearly every country, nuclear state, has them. Maybe only North Korea has about 10. China has about 240. Again, enough to do it, probably. But they don't have so many thermonuclear weapons as that. There is no reason in the world, legitimately, in the light of these findings, which are totally ignored by the Defense Department and well scientifically established, there is no legitimate reason for one country to have a doomsday machine of this sort, capable of ending life on Earth and likely to do so when the control system breaks down, which it's come close to doing a number of times. And that's not just the United States, but we're, by far the leading ones. The other ones have only 300 to start with. We have still 2,000 at this point on alert, the alert I've been talking about. And so do the Russians. And we have another 3,000 on active reserve and another 5,000 thermonuclear weapons that are supposed to be dismantled, but haven't been yet. So we have about 10,000. They have about 10,000, 12,000. This is outrageous, immoral. It's evil doing, and it's not done by evil people. I don't relate to the concept in my life now of evil people very much. These are very ordinary people. I was ordinary at the time, and the people I was working with were ordinary people, conscientious, patriotic, and we were all working on design and maintenance of a doomsday machine. And there wasn't a good reason for it then, although we imagined there was. And there's no reason at all. Now it's even hard to imagine a reason. It's just there, and we keep doing it. That's got to change. The other thing, I know I should close here, but I just can't resist telling you what the other thing I was reading in the green room, which I just got down. It's John F. Kennedy's speech before the General Assembly of the United Nations. John F. Kennedy's speech before the General Assembly of the United Nations, September 25th, 1961. Days later, he got the information that there were 4 missiles. Days later, after this speech. The Berlin Wall had just gone up. 2 months earlier, over the Berlin crisis, he had told us to build fallout shelters in the country because we were heading toward a nuclear war with the Soviets. And he didn't know then that the Soviets had only 4 missiles by any means. So in the middle of that, he gives this speech, which is this, and this part, and his recommendations. Today, before the UN, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. This is 20 to 30 years before anyone has conceived of nuclear winter or nuclear famine. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. I have to say, when we discovered they had 4 weapons, I myself participated in writing a speech for Gilpatrick that says, "We know what you have, back down over Berlin." But more important than that, in a way, that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. McNamara, after knowing they had 4, okayed 1,000 Minutemen. 1,000. Now, SAC wanted 10,000, literally. 6,000, 10,000. So he came down to 1,000. But after knowing they had 4, Kennedy did this because, as McNamara said, if I go below 1,000, we'd be impeached. That might have been true if he hadn't told the public what the story was. He did not reveal that the Soviets had only 4 missiles by any means at that point. That people understood that his missile gap campaign rhetoric the year before had proven to be a little overblown. They didn't know for many years that the Soviets had nothing, essentially. But anyway, good talk. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish it. He didn't do it, but man no longer debate, he says, whether armaments are a symptom or cause of tension. Well, they do this week, let me tell you. The mere existence of modern weapons, 10 million times more powerful than any the world has ever seen, and only minutes away from any target on Earth, 30 then, but 10 with the Pershing, is a source of horror and discord and distrust. Men no longer maintain that disarmament must await the settlement of all disputes, for disarmament must be a part of any permanent settlement, and men may no longer pretend that the quest for disarmament is a sign of weakness. Every Republican candidate except Ron Paul is throwing that challenge to our president, to Obama, this month. In a spiraling arms race, a nation's security may well be shrinking even as his arms increase. For 15 years, this organization, the UN, has sought the reduction and destruction of arms. Now that goal is no longer a dream. It is a practical matter of life and death. This has been the theme of David's Nuclear Age Peace Foundation since its founding in 1982. The risks inherent in disarmament pale in comparison to the risks inherent in an unlimited arms race. So he goes to recommendations, and because he says it's not enough just to disarm. Oh, no, here's what we should do. We are proposing a mutual ban on atmospheric testing, that we did get, but not underground, to halt the spread of these terrible weapons, proliferation, to halt the contamination of the air, to halt the spiraling arms race. We must remain ready to seek new avenues of agreement. Our new disarmament program thus includes the following proposals. David, I think prepare to cry when you hear this. First, signing the Test Ban Treaty by all nations. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is not ratified by us yet. It's going to be a hard fight, I just heard, by Obama. Let me just say, if it's passed, I'll be astonished. This can be done now, 60 years ago. Test ban negotiations need not and should not await general disarmament. Second, stopping the production of fissile materials for use in weapons, and preventing any transfer to any nation now lacking in nuclear weapons. Third, prohibiting the transfer of control over nuclear weapons to states that do not own them. Fourth, keeping nuclear weapons from seeding new battlegrounds in outer space, the Air Force's current program. Fifth, gradually destroying existing nuclear weapons and converting their materials to peaceful uses. Finally, halting the unlimited testing and production of strategic nuclear delivery vehicles and gradually destroying them as well. And he says, unless man can match his strides in weaponry and technology with equal strides in social and political development, our great strength like that of the dinosaur, will become incapable of proper control, and like the dinosaur, vanish from the earth. That was in 1961. The theory of nuclear winter came from the discovery 20 years later by a guy I worked with, Louis Alvarez, Nobel Prize winner, who had designed the detonation system for the nuclear weapon. Louis Alvarez and his son discovered it was not the small brain of the dinosaur and the lack of control. It was an asteroid hitting the Earth that destroyed the vegetation on which the dinosaurs had fed for millions of years and killed not just the dinosaurs, but 70% of all species on Earth, and everything over a certain weight, 25 pounds, 50 pounds or something. They all died. Our ancestors were very tiny little mammals at that point. Only small things survived. For 50 years, we have had the ability to cause the 6th mass extinction, of which the dinosaurs were the 5th. And to do it because of our tiny brains. Our brains are big enough. The brain isn't the problem here. A lack of intelligence of a usual sort, IQ sort, the ability to win campaigns. It takes intelligence of some sort. Let's move on from that thought. But that hasn't been the problem. But the problem is different. A willingness, a readiness to contemplate, plan, prepare, and threaten something that for 20 years we've known meant probably the destruction of complex life on Earth. So that's the challenge to us. I just read today that Obama is the first one to propose a program as a president for achieving abolition. Not so. That's a pretty damn good program, and not hardly any part of it, except the atmospheric test ban, has been enacted 60 years later. It's Obama's program, supposedly, but rather relaxed about it, not urgent, not expecting to get it in his lifetime. Well, we've got to do better than that. So that's why we're here. That's why the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is at it, to try to get Barack Obama in his next 4 years to carry out President John F. Kennedy's abortive program.